live their own rebellious ways. This became a pattern from generation to generation. Israel's greatest judge was Samuel. He followed God's ways and spoke for God as a prophet. He told Israel that God was the only king they ever needed. But they desired to be like the corrupt nations surrounding them and insisted, "We want a human king who we can see to rule over us just like the other nations." So Samuel found a man named Saul to be Israel's first king. His reign began well, but before long, Saul stopped following God's ways and made many bad decisions. So Samuel told Saul, "Because you have turned your back on God, God has rejected you as a king." Samuel's search for the next king led to a courageous young shepherd married woman and committed a murder to cover it up. But deep inside, David always loved God and would return to living in God's ways. Known as the poet warrior, he wrote music to God called psalms, heartfelt expressions of prayer, struggle, and thankfulness. After many years as king, David gave the throne to his son Solomon. God also told David, "One day, one of your descendants will rule with a kingdom that will never end." Solomon succeeded his father David, becoming the richest king in Israel's history. Full of God's wisdom, Solomon wrote books like Proverbs and built a magnificent temple, a permanent tabernacle reminding people of God's continual presence. But Solomon strayed from God, marrying corrupt wives who led him into worshiping false gods. Civil war broke out, dividing the country into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Soon, both of these kingdoms were led by corrupt kings who ignored God's ways. During this time, prophets were sent as messengers, calling the Israelites to return to God. They warned of the destructive consequences ahead. The prophet Elijah, a wild and rugged man, showed up false prophets by calling on God to give an awesome display of fire. The prophet Elisha followed him, bringing a boy back to life by causing him to sneeze. These prophets challenged the Israelites and their kings to return to God's better ways. But the Israelites would not listen.
There you go. We're all up to date, right? Who knew the Bible was so simple?
Good morning, church. I wanted to also share a few things. So as you have heard, hopefully, we now have the beautiful prayer room just to my right, which has a door here so you can make a little exit out there at the end of the service. And we're just so excited of the opportunity we have to really use that space, and not just on a Sunday, but during the week as well. There was even talk of a secure lock that can be applied. So you could be like, put in the code and, book in and go and pray with someone when it suits. So that's really exciting, and I'm excited for that. And with that is also an opportunity that presents itself for us to really seek wisdom about how it is that we develop a deeper level of prayer culture around our church and in our homes, and just really consider what it is to pray. It is just such a gift. I mean, if you really stop to think about it, it's crazy. Like, God, who created the entire universe, calls us to pray, to have dialogue, to talk with him. And, whether that's just little one-on-ones with him, with words, without words.
Sorry, it's a long walk in the back. I'm tired, I'm out of breath. I'm not really. Today is our second last week in the Testament series, and we're going to, kind of get some discussion going to start us all off today. Hopefully you feel like that recap video that we watched has brought you up to speed, and hopefully you feel like you're following along the story so far. It's hard to believe, isn't it? Only 2 weeks left, and we will have done the whole Old Testament. We've done the whole story. Amazing, that's pretty fast. Then we start the New Testament, but that's shorter, so, and covers less time as well. So we're going to start some discussion. There are going to be some questions up on the screen just for you to talk about around your tables that relate to what we're thinking about today. So the first couple of questions will be there in a second. They are, there we go. How do you think most Aussies feel about God today? And what do you think most Aussies think about Christians? Okay, well, hopefully that's enough time to have broached the topic a bit. You know, I didn't have this in my notes. I wasn't thinking about this story, but just our chat at the table made me think about it. There's this great story from the sort of early settler days of Australia, the British colonialism when they first moved over. The first church in Australia was built in August 1795. I was just looking at it this week. And shortly after they built the first church in Sydney, they implemented a law that said all Australians must go to church at least once a week. And in October, they burned the church down. The settlers decided that's a terrible rule, and they burned the first church down 3 months after it was built. That's the story of the first church in Australia. It's pretty funny, isn't it? Not a particularly religious bunch, potentially, or I think that's at least a reputation that Aussies have. But as we were chatting about on our table, I don't know whether you guys on your tables decided the same thing, but spirituality is actually pretty big in Australia. The number of atheists in Australia is actually on the decline, and there's an increase in the number of people who would say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I believe there's something more to life, and I believe that there's some kind of answers out there, or bigger questions out there, but I wouldn't say I'm a Christian, or I wouldn't say I'm religious or something like that. It's interesting, isn't it? To think about all these different things of what our culture thinks about God, thinks about Christians today. Hopefully you had some good discussion on your table there. Well, we already, like I said, watched the recap video, so we won't spend much time doing that this week. But a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about under King David, this nation of Israel, being kind of at the apex of their story, the apex of their power. Certainly they had a huge military, and really they were living, I guess, a pretty peaceful existence as the people of God living in the promised land that they had been promised to their father Abraham. And so this covenant that God had made with his people about a great nation and about living in this promised land, God had made good on his side of the covenant. And they were getting to enjoy God being faithful to his covenant. And so then the question has become, is Israel, God's people, going to be faithful to their side of the covenant? Are they going to be his people, living his ways, to be shining the light to the rest of the world, showing the rest of the world, bringing restoration to humanity through their family? Well, as we sort of saw last week, shortly after David with King Solomon, things, and we saw a little bit in the video too, things sort of started to, the corruption kind of was creeping back in. Even David wasn't perfect, but at least he had a contrite heart. He was genuinely sorry for the mistakes that he would make. He really wanted to follow God, even though he didn't always do it perfectly. Solomon, a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more corrupt. And then by the time of Solomon's sons, only 2 generations after David, things had already gotten pretty bad. And as we saw last week, the kingdom under David's grandson Rehoboam, the kingdom of Israel actually splits into 2. And we had a map there last week. You might have to click through it. Yeah, you can keep clicking until the map's full, sorry. But this is basically the kingdom split into 2 parts, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, under 2 different kings. The people of God now split into half, and there's civil war that goes on between them. I've nicked Phil's slide and didn't realize he does like fancy animations where you have to like click through them. I don't really do that. So if you keep clicking, there we go. And oh wow, a whole bunch of thumbs. Did you put them all in individually, Phil? That's pretty impressive. Copy paste still, that's pretty good. Actually, I wonder how mine's going to animate then by the time we get to mine. And then there's some prophets that go along. So this was the story that we were looking at last week. If you missed it, you can catch it up online. But this is the story that we were looking at last week where, yeah, there's all these different kings from about 200 years that all have different turns of leading the people of the northern kingdom. So in the north, they decided to keep the name Israel. In the south, they decided to go with the name Judah, which was like the tribal name of the south already. And if you've ever wondered why they're called Jews, even though they're from Israel, it's because they're from Judah. It's pretty, interesting, I think. So all these different kings and then these prophets who come and are pleading with them, you're, not living as God's people. God's been faithful to his side of the covenant. You need to be faithful to your side of the covenant. But they continue to just live in sin and corruption. And as you can see, every king in the north gets the thumbs down from Phil, the thumbs down from God as well. And they're all pretty terrible kings. And finally, in 722, this other nation, Assyria, comes in, sweeps through and conquers the whole land, and the whole northern kingdom of Israel and that whole area just becomes absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. So that was what we looked at last week, and we saw some of the stories of these different prophets warning the kings and pleading with the kings, please, we need to be faithful to God, but they're not. So then we flick to the next slide. Oh yeah, this is going to be interesting. Let's have a look at what happens when we press the button. So there's Israel. Anyone remember? Judah, that's right. And then we'll keep flicking. Thanks, Chris. He's a legend. He's a wizard. Oh yeah, that little picture up there. Here we go. Okay. Oh, and we've got all these different kings. Wow. Keep flicking. I don't know, see what happens. Well, it's a little out of order. Keep going. We'll get all the thumbs up. There we go. And a few more prophets. Yeah, it's a little out of order, but there we go. Freeze. Perfect. We'll leave it there. So you can see the South Kingdom's story is a little bit different. They also have lots of different kings. And you can see, actually one more. There's one missing. There we go. So in 722 was that other timeline when Israel was defeated by the Syrian Empire. You can see that the south, Judah, keeps going for a little bit. They're not conquered by Assyria. They manage to hold out and be strong and continue to be people. And Jerusalem, where the temple is down in Judah. So the temple's still intact. The nation of Judah is still intact. But you can see they have a story that's a little bit different to the northern kingdom, where there's some kings that are pretty terrible and lead the people pretty terribly, but there are actually some kings who do a pretty good job. Again, like David, they're not perfect, but they genuinely want to live up to their side of the covenant. They genuinely want to be that light to the nations, even if they might make mistakes. Generally, they're really having a go at trying to be God's people. And again, God's sending all these different prophets. Some of them, have their own books and stuff you might recognize. God's sending these prophets to try and convince the people of God and the kings to live as God's people, to be faithful to the covenant, to be that light to the nations. And even after Israel is defeated, they continue on for a little bit. But there is this ultimate kind of just spiral of sin and corruption. And even though some of the good kings sometimes help them to get back on track, ultimately they return to their old ways and things just continue to spiral and spiral and spiral, as we're going to look at today. And eventually, in 586, even the southern kingdom of Judah is defeated by Babylon. So if we go to the next slide, this is Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 13 to 17. This is a warning that one of those prophets at the end there, Jeremiah, speaking in those final days of the southern kingdom, this is the warning that Jeremiah brings. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling, I answered. It is tilting toward us from the north. The Lord said to me, from the north, disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. Their kings will come and set up thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. They will come against her surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgments on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshipping what their hands have made. So God is warning this southern nation of Judah that he's going to send other armies. He's going to send another empire to come and conquer them, to finally take over the whole nation of Israel. And you can see there's a map there from last week that we looked at, where Assyria has come and taken over the whole northern kingdom. Let's have a look at what happens then the week after. So eventually Babylon, this other empire from the north, just as God said would happen, comes and takes over the whole region. You can see that's a pretty total destruction of the whole region. And in fact, if we zoom out the map a bit, you can see just how big the Babylonian Empire expands to. Israel's just that small little section of the coast. Oh, where's that laser pointer, Phil? Oh, yeah, here. You can see here, right? This is the whole area of Israel, just a small little part of the whole. Oh, good. So maybe a question on some people's minds is, why did God raise up these other nations to defeat Israel? These are God's chosen people. You know, there were some good kings in there, some good kings and some bad kings. It's easier with the northern kingdom to think, well, they were all bad kings, so eventually, sure, do away with it. But there were some good kings in the southern kingdom. So why would God let this happen? Why would God allow this huge empire of Babylon, not just allow it, but in fact, it says that he raised up Babylon to come and do this. Why would God make it happen? I've got a bit of a question just for you to ponder for yourself, just to think about. Would you turn your child over to the cops if they committed a crime? If they had done something wrong, would you call up the police and tell on your child? Maybe some people would be going, yes. Maybe some people would be saying no. Phil's definitely yes. He's thought about doing it a couple of times. I've thought about dubbing your kids into the police a couple of times. Maybe it depends on what the crime is. Thank you, Shirani. Maybe it depends. This isn't really an interactive experience, but no, it is. There's a lot of heckling. Anyway. Maybe it depends on what the crime is. Maybe it depends on exactly what they've done. Maybe it depends on if it's a first offense, if it's quite out of character. Maybe it was just a mistake. There's a whole lot, aren't there, of different situations that might arise. Maybe some people would say, no matter what happened, I'd be faithful to my kid. I'd never do something like that. Well, God doesn't just immediately, when he sees the wrongdoing that his children are doing, he doesn't just immediately punish them for their wrongdoing. He warns them time after time. In fact, year after year, crime after crime, he begs with them, he pleads with them to stop what they're doing, to stop the way that they're living. But he does say, eventually, I'm not going to just keep talking or keep begging you or keep pleading with you. Eventually, something's actually going to have to happen. Let's keep reading through Jeremiah chapter 7, where he talks about exactly what they've actually been doing. Was it just kind of petty crimes or what was it? This is what it says in Jeremiah chapter 7. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we are safe? Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. The people of Israel have not made good on their covenant. In fact, really, the people of God are just as bad, maybe even worse, than these other nations around them. They're supposed to be this sort of shining example. They've been given from God instructions on how they're supposed to live. They're not even trying to follow them. They're not even interested. And the worst part of all of it is that despite committing all these crimes, they then actually come to God and say, yes, God will protect us. We're safe here. All these other nations can't do anything about it because we've got God on our side. God is sort of saying to them, you can't just rely on me being faithful to my covenant as an excuse for you to just live however you want. You can't come back home to mum's house or to dad's house and kind of go, sweet, my dad's the police commissioner. No one can touch me. I can commit as many crimes as I want. Eventually, I'm going to actually have to do something about this. We'll keep reading from Jeremiah chapter 6, which says, from the least to the greatest, all are greedy for gain. Prophets and priests alike, all practice deceit. They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. Are they ashamed of their detestable conduct? No, they have no shame at all. They do not even know how to blush. So they will fall among the fallen. They will be brought down when I punish them, says the Lord. God says the people are trying to dress the wounds of the people as if they're not serious wounds. They're trying to just kind of cover it up to kind of go, look, the sin doesn't really matter. God's not really worried about this. It says even from the greatest to the lowest, both the leaders and the people, all are just corrupted and sinful. And not only are they sinful and broken and doing the wrong thing, but they're completely unashamed about it. They're completely unapologetic. They don't want to change. They're happy with the way that things are going. This week, you might know, was Harmony Week, all about inclusivity and all about, respect. And the school had an anti-bullying day. A lot of schools around had an anti-bullying day. I often think about God almost as like the teacher in a classroom trying to manage different students. And maybe it was because I spent a couple of years doing teaching in the classroom. But I often think about that. That imagine one student is just relentlessly harassing and bullying another student. And God's the teacher. And God says to the bully, mate, you have to stop doing that. That's actually not okay. We don't allow that here in the classroom. And despite his instruction, the bully doesn't let up at all. It just kind of continues day after day, harassing and abusing even. And the teacher says, listen, this is really not acceptable. We actually can't tolerate this, and explains to him why it's completely impossible. He tries to reason with him. Nothing happens. And the bullying only gets worse. In fact, the bullying starts turning violent to this poor victim of the bullying. Now, what does the teacher do in that situation? The teacher cares about, hopefully, all the students in their class. So does the teacher go, well, look, I don't really want to punish the bully because I care about the bully, so I'll keep trying to explain it to them, but hopefully they'll get it eventually. Now, eventually a time comes when the teacher has to deliver warnings. Listen, if you don't stop this, there's going to actually have to be some consequences for your actions. And if it continues, would it be a good teacher, a loving teacher who says, well, I keep warning them and I don't want to punish them, so I'm just going to let them keep going? No, a good teacher, a loving teacher would eventually step in and stop it and deliver some sort of punishment to bring an end to the injustice. Eventually, God stops saying to the people of Israel, hey guys, seriously, please, listen, I'm begging you. Eventually, he has to stop warning them. Eventually, he actually brings judgment. He brings an end to the injustice. And Jeremiah delivers the message to say to the people, time's up. That's enough warnings now. It's been hundreds and hundreds of years. I can't let this keep going. We're going to have to end this now. We'll read from Jeremiah chapter 8 and part of chapter 9. Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet because of this message that he has to deliver to the people of God. The harvest is past, the summer has ended, and we are not saved. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, and horror grips me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is there no healing for the wound of my people? Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Consider now, call for the wailing women to come, send for the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly and wail over us, till our eyes overflow with tears and water streams from our eyelids. The sound of wailing is heard from Zion. How ruined we are, how great is our shame. We must leave our land because our houses are in ruins. You can see that it's not an easy thing for God to have done. You can see that God is distraught for his people when it comes time eventually for the southern kingdom to be destroyed and overtaken. This is so far from what God wanted for his people, but really he couldn't just keep going. He couldn't just issue more warnings for another hundreds of years. Jeremiah's message is that judgment is coming and it's going to be terrible. but he gives them even still a kind of way out, a kind of option for survival, for mercy. He says, this nation that's coming of Babylon, you need to surrender to them. They're going to take over you no matter what. If you surrender, you'll at least spare yourselves. You'll spare your lives. That's the message that Jeremiah gives to the people. Surrender. How does Israel respond? Let's have a look in Jeremiah chapter 38. Oh gosh, here we go. Jephthah, son of Matan, Gedaliah, son of Pashur, Jehuka, son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, son of Malchijah, heard what Jeremiah was telling all the people when he said, "This is what the Lord says. Whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine, or plague. But whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. They will escape with their lives. They will live. And this is what the Lord says. This city will certainly be given into the hands of the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it." Then the officials said to the king, "This man should be put to death. He is discouraging the soldiers who are left in the city, as well as all the people, by the things he is saying to them. This man is not seeking the good of these people, but their ruin." "He is in your hands," King Zedekiah answered. "The king can do nothing to oppose you." So they took Jeremiah and put him in the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank down into the mud. So this prophet of God offering the people a chance of survival, a chance of hope to surrender. The people in the city say, "Hey, that's not good for morale. That's not good for the soldiers. We don't want this man making our people afraid." So they take him and they put him down into a well so that no one has to listen to what he has to say. The people don't want to hear what God is saying to them. And in Jeremiah chapter 39, it says this: "In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army and laid siege to it. And on the 9th day of the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11th year, the city wall was broken through." That's the siege. That is Israel being conquered by the Babylonians. You can see just from the times there, it was a year and a half of siege where the kingdom of Judah is being attacked and people are being starved out. Siege is a pretty horrible thing. And a year and a half later, eventually, the city succumbs and the people are conquered. So what happens now that the nation of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, has taken over this southern nation of Judah? Well, there's a couple of different options for what an invading army can do. And what ends up happening to the people of God is something called exile. Now, if you let the Israelites stay in the land and live in their houses and live in their cities, and you just have an occupying force that sort of guards them and makes them work or something like that, there's a great risk that at some point the people will grow and rise against you, that they'll harbor hatred for you, and that at some point you're going to be dealing with some sort of insurrection and some rebellious force on your hands, and you might have to fight them again in the future. Another option is you can just wipe them all out. But there's a third option, which is exile, which is that you take all the people living in that land and you scatter them throughout the rest of the empire. You spread them out through the whole empire of Babylon. You send them to all different cities and provinces and towns, and you actually just absorb them into your empire. So you make them speak your language, you make them observe your culture, you make them dress the same way as the rest of your people. And over time, actually, your empire has just grown. You've got more people now living in your empire, more men for your army, more women to work. You've actually got you've just expanded your empire. Does that make sense? And that was exactly what Babylon did with the people of Israel. They took them and they sent them out of their land. So they've kicked them out of the promised land and spread them now throughout the rest of the Babylonian Empire. Now, during this time, this period of exile, you have lots of different stories. And we're more than halfway through today. But you have lots of different stories from exile of people who are now living in the Babylonian Empire. And then after the Babylonians, there are other empires that come along, the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans under Jesus' time, that come along and sort of are in control of God's people. And there's all these different stories of the people of God trying to be faithful to who they are, but they're living now in another country with different values, different beliefs. One of those guys is a man named Daniel. And we're going to read from Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So basically what's happening in the start of Daniel is that these nobles, these sort of royal celebrities kind of Israel, these princes, kind of if you took the royal families of England or something like that, like Israel had its own royal families, and they took them, these kind of celebrities in Israel, and they really took care of them in Babylon. They dressed them up in Babylonian clothes. They gave them new Babylonian names. They got them to eat Babylonian foods, to speak the language, to do all that sort of stuff, so that hopefully, now that they're trying to get the Israelites to assimilate, they'd see their celebrities. Hey, that's David Beckham, and now he's dressing like a Babylonian and whatever. Or that's, I don't know, who's an Aussie celebrity? Someone? Russell Coight? That's Russell Coight, and he's dressed up as a Babylonian. And would it be nice to think of a real person rather than a character? I can't. Anyway. Sorry? Oh. Who's our Prime Minister? Malcolm Turnbull. No, is that him? Scott Morrison. Look, you can't keep track. Australia moves too quick. Scott Morrison. ScoMo. Scotty from marketing. Everyone, come on. Relax. Dress Scott Morrison up in Babylonian clothes. Everyone, will see him and kind of go, oh, well, look, if he's fitting in so well, he seems to be really enjoying life as a Babylonian. We'll all join in, right? And that was kind of part of their strategy of exile and getting the people to assimilate. And so when you read through Daniel's story, that's kind of what's happening, is the Babylonians are trying to use Daniel as kind of this example to the people of Israel of, hey, live as a Babylonian. And Daniel is there trying to figure out, how do I be faithful to God while I'm living in this other country? And if we might just go to the next slide. Thanks, Chris. There's a whole bunch of stories in Daniel where people are trying to navigate life in exile. There's that great story of, on the right there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these other 3 sort of noble princes of Israel that have been kind of made part of the leadership now in this Babylonian Empire, where they're told that all people had to bow down to this statue. And they refuse. They say, no, actually, we're followers of Yahweh. We don't do that. We're not going to bow. And they get thrown in a furnace, and God's there and he protects them. There's another story about Daniel, who the people are told, you're not allowed to pray to any other god. There's this law passed in the empire. You're not allowed to pray to anybody other than the king of Babylon. And Daniel says, well, I'm a follower of Yahweh. And he goes and he still prays 3 times a day, and he gets found out. And he gets thrown in a lion's den, and God's also there and protects him as well. All these different stories of people now living in an empire, far from home, far from the promised land, trying to figure out, how do we be faithful to God? And, this period of exile is really one of my favorite sections of all of Scripture, and particularly one of my favorite sections from the Old Testament, because I think there are so many parallels for us today. There are so many parallels between the people of God living in this other nation that doesn't know God, whose values are different to the ones that God set out for them. I think there's a lot of similarities for us to be thinking about today. You know, values change over time. Every generation has a new set of values and beliefs and things that they consider right and things that they consider terrible. And I mean, it's interesting, you know, like even our generation today would probably look at previous generations and go, how could they have thought that? How could they believe that? That's terrible. That's despicable. And their generation looked at the generations before them and thought, hey man, how could they act like that back then? That's so terrible. That's awful. You know, how could that be the norm? And the reality of it all is that the generation to come after us is going to look back at us and ask the same questions. How could they believe that? How could they value those things? How could they? Every generation has always done that with the generation before. Values change, beliefs change. The people of Israel are here wrestling through how do we engage with an empire that has very different values with God. At what parts of their life do they say, well, I can actually be a model citizen here. I can actually be a good example to this people. And then at other times they have to say, actually, with all due respect, I don't do that. I don't actually agree with that. I'm not going to go along with that. And there are other stories like the story of Esther and lots of stories in the Old Testament about that period of time where the people are living in exile. Sometimes they had to figure out in what ways they had to be countercultural to their society, to the empire that they're living in. Sometimes I think today we think that we're the only people who have ever had to go through this, that, you know, we're living in a world post-Christianity, that we're living in a world that doesn't really know God or doesn't really accept God, or where maybe spiritualism is accepted, but, you know, Christianity is not really accepted. And maybe we feel like that's a modern problem, but it's been a problem for thousands of years. People of God trying to wrestle through how to be faithful in a world that doesn't know God. I often like talking about this with our young people and thinking about some of these issues with our young people. And a line that I like to talk about with them is the idea that this world is not our home, that actually this earth and this society that we're a part of, it's actually not our home, that heaven is our home, that God is our King, and that as much as this is still God's earth, and as much as, you know, we need to engage with it and we need to, appreciate the beauty and that this is, God's world and he's still in control. There are a lot of things still that we see and that we hear that are not in line with God's plan for us or God's plan for humanity. When we watch TV, when we listen to music, when we engage with different things, you get all sorts of different messages. Some of them are God's values and some of them aren't. So how do we handle all this? Do we resist the world? Do we hide in a little bubble and just kind of, you know, be our own people and don't let the world corrupt us kind of thing? Do we go the other end? Do we just try and blend in, just kind of assimilate into the world that we're a part of? These are the questions that exile presents. And it's a pretty hard situation for the people of God now during this time. They've just been defeated. They've been through some pretty hard things. They're full of despair about the nation that's been lost as they're kicked out of their land. But God gives them hope. This is sort of the final bit for today. God gives them a hope for the future. To Daniel, he gives them a really big prophecy about someone who's coming. In Daniel chapter 9, if you want to have a read of it. Someone who's going to come and who's going to actually change things. A Messiah who's going to bring the restoration to humanity once and for all. This restoration that Israel's been trying to work out hasn't worked. But a Messiah is going to come. He's going to make things right. And there's another prophecy in Jeremiah, that prophet that we were reading about before. This is the last thing we're going to read. In chapter 29, it says, "This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. So there's this hope that actually they will return, that the exile won't last forever. They'll get to come back to the promised land. And there's also that other promise that God is sending someone to break the cycle once and for all, to deal with humanity's sin, to bring humanity back into restoration. That's where we sort of leave the story this week. There's only one installment of the Old Testament left to go, and then we've done the whole thing. But the questions for us to wrestle through this are those questions about exile, about living in a foreign land. We're going to have, I love that line, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. So you can stay. That's cool. All right. Yeah, it's a great reminder for God, even for the people when they were in exile. He was there with them the whole time, giving them strength for today and also a bright hope for tomorrow. A reminder that exile is not forever. Something for us to think about as well. We've got some discussion questions, which would be good. If you're able, if you need to take off, then go for it. But if you have an opportunity for 5 or 10 minutes to sit, and hopefully we can get these discussion questions up on the screen. My notes are down there. A couple of things to think about to unpack some of this idea of exile. What do you think is hard about being a Christian in 2021? And in what ways are we Christians called to be countercultural?